I don't know how much anybody knows about the UN, but I'm just going to say a few things. When we had the world wars, it suddenly became clear that no country could deal with the problems that we were having, and that more and more problems were world problems, and that there was only one way forward, and that was that we would have a parliament of peoples, where people would look at what we had in common, the sort of problems that we had in common, and how we could get over that. So the United Nations is basically, it's an organization in which every country is a member, and those are the bosses. They're sort of like the board of directors. And then they have their secretary, Ban Ki-moon is their little secretary, and he's got people working for him, all sorts of different people. So this is really what the United Nations is. And the United Nations started out after the Second World War, and they said, well, how can we go further? And we're sort of in a stage of history which is a bit like the United States was in before you became a federal republic. What you had was separate states, and each state was the boss. And so you could have terrible wars, and you did have terrible wars. And then when the federal government took over, you had a togetherness, and there was just one law. And now you can't see Alabama fighting Mississippi. You know, that's not going to happen. There'll be little rivalries. But where we are right now in the world is that we have, you know, 193 countries, perhaps a few more, and they're all part of the United Nations, and they're all finding all sorts of problems. And initially, after the First World War, they said, we're never ever going to do this. We're here together in San Francisco, where they started, and to save succeeding generations from the scourge of war. And basically our job is to help the world develop out of poverty, and to keep the peace and make the peace. So we went into the dark ages of, you know, of the Cold War. And really all that existed was two countries fighting, and for the rest nothing else existed. It was all just. And then we had glasnost and perestroika, and the Soviet Union fell apart. And suddenly all these problems which had been part of the UN system and that they were working on, but had never been able to see the light of day, came up. And amongst them was development of people who were in suffering, and the environment. And so in '92 we had the second actually environmental conference, and that was the Earth Summit. And that's when they started looking at all these different things. How are we going to go forward with that? And 20 years later, that was in June of 2012, they'd had meetings every year to look at the different aspects, how they were doing. And then in June 2012 they got together and they said, well, let's look at what we're doing. I told the friends that we were with just a couple of nights ago that that the negotiations between the countries were very difficult in June 2012, and so basically they came out with the world we want, but they couldn't really make any decisions, except for Colombia and Guatemala got up and they said, look, we've got to find some goals that we're going to meet, because we're not going to make it. Our world, there are about 9 different types of planetary boundaries which scientists know exist and that we cannot transgress. And 7 of them they can actually measure. And we're basically on the cusp or have exceeded the climate change, biodiversity, and the phosphorus-nitrogen cycle. And there we're sort of out of balance. So we've got to a point where those systems are no longer reliable. They're in balance, out of balance, out of whack with each other. And so what happens is when a system is on the verge of changing, Well, there's an experiment, and they have sort of a round saw, and like one of those round saws, and they put sand on it, and then they take a bow and they bring a vibration, and what happens is the sand takes on a beautiful form, and then they change the rate of vibration, and what you see, the sand becomes all ugly and chaotic, and then it takes on another form. So Prigogine, who was the Nobel Prize winner on this particular subject, he said, what happens is, when a system's out of whack, it goes out of balance, and it takes on all this chaos, and then it goes into another level of balance. So we know for sure that there's 3 of these systems which are completely out of balance. But all these systems are tied together, whether it's nature, whether it's the oceans, whether it's the cycle of the weather, whether it is the various animals that interrelate with each other and survive because they provide habitat and food for each other, or whether they're humans. And in the human society, they're out of whack, but humans are into all the time affecting nature in all its forms, but they're also affecting each other. And we have we have discrimination against women, against the primitive peoples, against children, against older people, against anybody who's any different. And, we have all these types of different forms in which we're fighting each other. And all these fights are also interacting, while the water is interacting with the soil and the earth, all these things are interacting. Now this is a particularly dicey situation because all these things are interacting, and it 2 or 3 might be out of whack, but they can still be kept in whack. But sometimes you just give a little bit, and suddenly all the systems seem to be going out this way, and the whole system, can really collapse. So we're in a very, very dangerous place. And so in June 2012, it was a terrifying moment because we could not get ahead with the negotiations. And we knew we had to come to some form of agreement, but we were not going to get an agreement because the countries were individuals, just like after in the United States, before there was a federation, each state was its own, and it was going to stay that way, and it was going to do what it could. So we were in that situation. And the only way forward was, because we couldn't get an agreement at that moment, was that they said, okay, well, we've had, and I told you both this story before, but between 2000 and the Millennium, the countries got together and they said, look, we're at the Millennium, we're going to have to make some big changes. And they put together the Millennium Development Goals. And one of them was to halve poverty, and they had, I think, 8 Millennium Development Goals. And basically those goals were for the poorer countries to finally, be given a bit of a boost. And in fact, the countries did halve poverty. Not all of them, but together in the world, we actually halved poverty in those 15 years between then and 2015, which is now. So then the countries got together. They said, well, the developing countries, the poor countries, are not just the only ones with problems, and not the only ones who are also causing problems, because, when they're very poor, then you get a lot of battles, and then the rich ones come in, and they want to get their share of whatever comes out of the spoils of battle. But the rich countries are the ones that are really ravaging the environment, even more than the poor countries. The poor countries will have to just take what they can because they have to feed themselves, but the rich ones are grabbing and enclosing areas and making money out of them. And so all countries are in this together. Every country has its role to play, and every country has to change its task, its way of interacting with the environment. And so what happened was, two countries were chosen as the coordinators. They're just, you can think of a therapy group. And so you've got 193 countries sitting around, and then 2 countries are the facilitators. And one was Hungary and the other one was Kenya. And these 2 ambassadors were not just ambassadors, but they were amazing human beings. And just as in a therapy situation, as a facilitator, as a therapist, you listen to everybody, and in the therapy situation, everybody has their fears. They're huge fears which they bring to that therapeutic situation, things that they might have to cover up, but also fears that they're going to lose control in their lives, like countries. You know, the government isn't really walking the line. It's terrified, that it's going to lose power, but every country has its things tied, things that it doesn't feel it's doing very well, and things that it feels quite proud about. So in this situation, if you have a therapy group where everybody is in pain and suffering and in tremendous anxiety, it's very, very hard to come to a decision. And the decision is very often a very low level decision. And these two men sat up there. Being a psychologist myself, I just felt so humbled by what these two diplomats, these two politicians, politicians, we all know they're crooked and bad, etc. But when you see some of them up front, these men were amazing men. And, countries get up and say, well, we're the boss, we're the countries, and we and you are facilitators, and you should do. And then they'll say, well, thank you, Iceland. I now give the word to Bangladesh. And yeah, thank you, Bangladesh. And Bangladesh might be moaning too. But they completely embraced the situation and let all the countries come out with the things that came up. And sometimes they were fears, and sometimes. But what they did was they knew that if we were going to survive, we could not survive in the normal way. We were going to have to attain goals that we'd never ever attained in our lives, and certainly never politically thought that we would want to or could. And that we were going to have to keep our eye on the ball. And for 18 months, they brought in more and more topics. We knew many of the topics that had to be dealt with, the forests and the waters, clean drinking water, sanitation. We knew all those things that they had to be dealt with. And they started to look at what had to happen in each of those situations. And they brought experts in, and these experts would speak. And the way the United Nations works is that when you have a meeting like that, then countries will voice their opinions. And the idea is what you're doing is you're creating global strategy. How are we as a world? What are the things we're going to agree so that we can all do later? And so the way this strategy works is that when a country makes its speech, its statement, as we say, it goes up and it's put online. And when at the end of the conference they come up with a document, it's put together with all these people actually have said, all these countries have said. And if they've been forced to relate to a goal up here, which we have to reach, you suddenly begin to get statements online that governments make, which are way beyond what a government would normally make. Governments, when they're afraid, which they have to be, are usually like this, but the statements they made would be up there. After 18 months, we came up with 17 Sustainable Development Goals. And these goals have basically been agreed. They can still be changed somewhat, but there's no country that wants to do that. And the reason is that these goals are all interrelated with each other. And if you change one of those goals, all the others are going to have to be renegotiated. And the beauty of that is when you see how everything fits together, suddenly everything becomes valuable. So if I see how these mountains fit together, then if I take away a stone or carve a hole in it, then that mountain might collapse. So let me give you an example, say women's rights. Now, the role that women have played, and we can, all of us, we've all been invited into the United Nations to come and give our views. The role that women have played has not been necessarily a very constructive. They'd all say, well, we have to have equal rights with men, and we do all the work, and, we often, suffer most, so we want equal rights. And this is you know. So countries thought, well, yeah, you know, of course women should have equal rights. So anyway, basically that was said, but it really wasn't created, and there wasn't a tremendous oomph behind it. Everybody said, yes, women have to have equal rights, and so we'll put that in equal, but there was no real oomph with it. Now, when we see that women's rights, the whole economy, if governments are going to finance their development, they're going to have a much bigger tax base if women have equal pay.
Wow.
And so what has happened now is we have a coalition in the UN, and if you listen to them, they go from every possible group of countries, they've got together behind the rights of women. And you can really see that women are now jolly well going to get their rights. Why? Because it hangs together with everything else. And if women get their rights, then you get a better tax base, then you get also better education, and suddenly all these things that people need. So this is how these goals get together. And I just like to end by reading them. And as I read them, I would like each one of you to think for yourself about any of the goals that have any meaning to you, and something you might do in your own life that might help that goal forward. And the reason I'm saying that is that the United States is absolutely in a horrible position right now. And if you listen to the United States will say, yes, and of course we have to be ambitious, and we have to think high, and we have to this and that, and basically it's hot air. They're not coming up with anything innovative. They're not coming up with anything, and the reason is because they're stuck. They're completely stuck. And you know, I basically don't even talk to the US because they're completely useless right now. But the problem is that this is the most wonderful country, and the people in this country are the most wonderful people. The conditioning of this country with this wide open view of what's possible, what can be done, and that creative energy that's part of this particular culture. And each culture has its beauties, but this is so important in this time, that particular is so important. But it's not going to even, I don't think these goals are really going to even trickle down, because I don't think that the government is in a place right now where it can happen. It's too stuck. So I think only way forward is actually for you know, people like you and me to actually do something in our communities. So I'm going to read these goals, and the first one is end poverty in all its forms everywhere. What an amazing goal, and the goal is to do that by 2030, 15 little years. And think of the poverty, think of the man in the parking lot near Safeways, you know. I mean, he's not the exception. In some parts of the United States, you have a whole lot more. And if you look in Rutherford, where I live, I mean, half the shops are empty. And you go to Holland, in the little village where I live, which is in the hub of Holland where most of the wealth is, shops are empty. You know, second-hand shops are coming in because people can't afford, you know, people are out of work, things like that. So end poverty in all its forms everywhere. The second one. So end hunger, achieve food security and improve nutrition and promote sustainable agriculture. End hunger, achieve food security, improve nutrition, and promote sustainable agriculture. We were talking about, and so many of you talked about that today, about the quality of nutrition. The third one is ensure healthy lives for all and promote well-being for all at all ages. So we're now talking about well-being, and this has been something brought in by Bhutan. Bhutan has a happiness index. It's no longer a question of how much money does a country make. You know, how much money do you have? It's a question of the well-being, how happy are the people. So well-being has found its way up at the top policy fields. So ensure inclusive and equitable quality education, and promote lifelong learning opportunities for all. So we don't stop at high school. We don't just get the facts, the 3 R's, but lifelong learning, that's where it's at. And that means each of us developing. And that brings us back to the human rights. Our basic right as a human being, acknowledged by all countries, is not just the right for the 3 R's, reading, writing, and arithmetic, but it's the right to develop. And in those days, they didn't have our present psychological jargon, but it was to develop the human personality, the full human personality. And basically, if we translate that into our more new age thinking, it's basically allow each human being to come from their uniqueness and to grow and develop in that way. So achieve gender equality and empower women and girls. The 6th one is ensure availability and sustainable use of water and sanitation for all. So water is a huge problem. We haven't yet tipped the balance on the water issue, but it's something which wars are going to be fought over. So ensure access to affordable, sustainable and reliable energy for all. And Ban Ki-moon is really behind energy. That's his big pet project. Number 8 is promote sustained, inclusive and sustainable economic growth, full productive employment and decent work for all. And here it's again, when we talk about decent work, we're not just talking about earning a living, we're talking about the work that really helps us as human beings. So build resilient infrastructure, promote inclusive and sustainable industrialization and foster innovation. So again, we're not talking about just making products in order to sell, but we're talking about sustainable industrialization. Number 11, make cities and human settlements inclusive, safe, resilient, and sustainable. 12, ensure sustainable consumption and production patterns, and of course that's something that we all are dealing with every day. 13 is take urgent action to combat climate change and its impacts. 14, conserve and and promote sustainable use of oceans, seas, and marine resources. And these are really dwindling right now. It's terrible shape, the oceans. 15, protect protect, restore, and promote sustainable management of forests and the use of terrestrial ecosystems. And that's combined with combating desertification and degradation and biodiversity loss. And the last goal is number 16. There are 17, but the last one is promote peaceful, inclusive societies, access to justice for all, and build effective and capable institutions for sustainable development. And then the last one is how are we going to implement this? And actually, Dev brought up the whole thing about partnerships, and you were talking about partnerships in small, and you know, a lot of us have been thinking about that today. But to strengthen the means of implementation and create a global partnership for sustainable development. And in this global partnership, each one of us plays a role. So these are the 17 goals. Sorry, it was rather long, and you've all been sitting very attentively. So these were the 17 goals. And the question is, you know, how can each one of us take these and implement them in our lives and in our families and in our communities? So that's what we're up to.
Beautiful.
Yeah. Might we be able
to
get a copy of that email to us? I would love to have the list. I would love
yes,
to have the
I was just looking at them, and I realized that this is a list in which I've added the original wording, and I hadn't got the original wording with me, so I'm going to have to print it out again. But that's why I was sort of stumbling over my words. I was adding in the bits that should have been there, which weren't in this particular draft.
So what is actually your role in all of this?
Well, it's actually a role that anybody of us can play. So in right from the beginning, we had the governments can't do it without the people. So when I started with the United Nations in 1969, I was started as a guide, um, and so we had 350 organizations. Of all the organizations in the world, there were just 350 organizations, and they were at the United Nations. They had a representative there, and as the governments talked about things, every now and again, these organizations could speak. So this has really changed with Perestroika and Glasnost. They suddenly invited everybody in, and so more and more organizations have come in. And then in June 2012, it changed. It was no longer just organizations, but it was stakeholders, which meant that people can also give their input to the United Nations. So the point is, if governments are really going to make it, they can't, because governments have to have their people to work with, whether they're very dictatorial or not. Unless they have their people behind them, they can't really function. And particularly when it comes to sustainable development, we're no longer talking about wars between the Soviet Union and the United States where they can throw a few bombs. But when we're talking about, ending poverty, well, each one of us is going to have to work on that. We have to work about our own poverty, work about the poverty of our children, and, where everyone has to help. And the government up there can't take care of Mrs. Smith down here in this little village who they don't even know exists, who might have some disease or whatever. So only if all people are involved in helping one another and making sure that Mrs. Smith's rights are listened to as a disabled person, are we going to get Mrs. Smith taken care of? And the aim of these is to leave nobody behind. So we really, when it comes to the well-being of human beings, their income, their schooling, their health, their access to water, their ability to fish in the oceans and find that there's still some fish left, we really have to have all people participate. So what happens then is that the United Nations have these meetings, and gradually we've developed these sustainable development goals, and each time the governments speak, they have sort of a text that comes out of that, and then the next conference they start with this text, and people like you and me can just go in and become part of that. And for the longest of times, our organizations have to have accreditation, and you had to go through a process in which you became accredited, and then you could send a member of your organization, or you could have 6 members, to attend these various meetings. And then at those meetings, we get chances to speak, and we get chances to talk about the topics that they're talking about. And at the same time, we have access to all the delegates who are making the decisions on the floor. So what I do is like, we're talking about financing, how are we going to finance this? And when I get back, they will have had a few days on that. And so I had to, last night, get in our particular view on how we're going to finance things. And so I wrote that up and I sent it off to colleagues of mine, and they're going to make a joint statement with various organizations. I sent a copy of what I wrote to another colleague, and he's going to send in a statement of the particular network that we're working with. And that then goes and is sent in, and we often send our things to all the heads of state and all the UN ambassadors. We send our views, and then we go to the meetings, and as they speak, when we have an opportunity to speak, we get up and speak. And we have, governments have about 3 minutes to speak, and we also have about 3 minutes. And if it's a government that's dealing with a network of governments, they have 5 minutes to speak. So you really learn to take very complex issues and put them down really very, and then you can send those statements in, and they get on the website, and they're taken into account, when they make their next agreement. Sometimes they don't. With financing, it's going to be a little harder. But so what I do is we have a network, and so I get together with the people from our network. They're all over the world. Many of them I don't know, and whoever's interested in a particular topic will phone in. Sometimes there's just a few and sometimes there's more. And then we have a Titan pad, and the topic we're discussing, we ask everybody to put their views on the Titan pad, and then we write up those views, and then we send, this is what our organization does. We send it out to the heads of state and ambassadors, we make a brief on it, and then when we listen to the topics, I usually get a seat sort of on the gangway, and I listen to what's being said, and as a country says something that ties in with what's interesting, I slip down and I make contact with the government. I give them my card, and I'll say, look, this, you said this and this, but have you thought of that and that? And then we give the whole, and that's how we give our input. Deb?
Just want to say what time.
Yes.
12:01.
It's time to go, is it?
12:01.
Oh, okay, good.
Yeah. Well,
So anyway,
did you have anything else you want to wrap up, or?
no, I think that's basically it. But except I want to say what I do is no exception. That any one of you can do what I do. People from every possible walk of life, whether they're artists or whether they're housewives or whether they represent the gypsies, or whatever, all different walks of life are needed. And it's at this point we're moving into the unknown, and the unknown is so big and so unmanageable that what we need is input from ordinary people, because often, the inspiration of ordinary people can suddenly bring a new cast on things and help the process forward. We are dealing with between 6 and 7 billion people right now, and so we all know from our own personal relationships that sometimes change is needed in a relationship, and that's not easy to do, even the ones that we love most. And so when you're dealing with 6 and 7 billion people, change is very, very hard. And so to really make your input stick, is something that you have to do together with other people. And then you just, hopefully it comes from many different directions, the things that you want to bring in, and that then change takes place. My own impression is right now that at the top political levels, we've reached a tipping point. And I really believe, I'm not an optimist, and I don't, I don't live on hope. I don't act from fear or hope. That's just, it doesn't work. You just have to do what you have to do. But if I had to say something, I've never felt this way in all the years that I started in '69 with the UN. I've never felt this way, but I feel that if a tipping point is reached, I think it's being reached right now. But we have to get ordinary people like myself and yourselves, acting in our everyday lives. So,
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank
Yes, thank you.